Hello, and welcome to New Approaches to Aligning Postsecondary Education and Work. I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, and I'm really pleased to be part of this week's New Horizons event from JFF. We're here to talk about what is one of the most active and fast-changing spaces in the broad world that we cover at Inside Higher Ed, the intersection between the learning in which students engage and the needs, demands, and expectations of employers. This terrain has historically been marked by quite a bit of finger pointing, employers blaming post-secondary institutions because they say the people they're hiring don't have the required skills and knowledge, academic leaders complaining that employers have moved the goalposts and increasingly expected colleges to do much of the training that companies once did. Fortunately, I think we're starting to move beyond that unproductive blame game as all the parties that have a stake in this, employers, institutions, policymakers, and others, recognize that it's essential to ensure that all Americans are prepared to participate in the economy and that no one party or sector can address that massive problem on its own. In today's session, we're going to talk to three people who come at this issue from very different vantage points. Michael Baston is president of Rockland Community College, which is part of the State University of New York system. Sabari Raja is co-founder and CEO of Nepris, whose platform connects learners and educators with industry professionals. And Rebecca Tabor, who's founder and co-CEO of Merit America, which works with employers to design programs aimed at giving adults without four-year degrees a path to skilled careers. I'm going to jump right in with a question. Well, welcome, first of all. I'm going to jump right in with a question for all three of you. We know that the worlds of education and work have been dramatically affected by the pandemic and the recession, though I'm not sure we know at this point exactly how they've been transformed. But I'm curious from each of you, what is your sense of how the landscape has changed? And please, in answering this first question, please give our audience a little bit more information about you and your organization so the listeners understand the perspective you're coming from. Maybe start with you, Sabari.
I was hoping you won't start with me, but that's fine. There was a 33% chance of that happening. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. I'm Sabari Raja, co-founder and CEO of Nepris. We are an education technology platform, primarily founded with the mission to use technology to bridge the gap between industry and education, to virtually connect students with working professionals in order to expand what I call their occupational identity and to bring the career exposure and real world learning to the classroom. So how things have changed since COVID. I mean, first of all, we've always been a virtual platform, so it has not been a huge change, right? But what I'm seeing both from employers, first from employers is there is now this, they're more ready to embrace sort of more of the virtual connections, whereas we've had more companies coming to us at this point saying, how can we really virtually engage with students? Before, it was more like, we have some in-person events and sessions and programs going on, and usually those in-person programs don't scale very well. They do have, high impact, but they don't scale very well. But there's this openness to embrace sort of virtual connections, which I feel can scale better and reach thousands of students. On the education side, the big change that we've seen post-COVID is supporting remote learners. I know, we may go back to, I don't know if we will actually go back to life exactly as we knew it before COVID, but there is some extent of this remote learning, virtual learning here to stay. And the big conversation between industry and education today is how do we support remote learners? But also the other thing is that the landscape of work has changed a little bit, So more and more companies are allowing work from home and remote work. So that's the key theme that I have noticed is how do we really function in this world of virtual, and how has that virtual changed the future of work and the jobs that we knew before COVID?
Michael, maybe you next in terms as an institutional perspective, how has your sense, what has changed in your sense of the interaction and that sort of intersection between students learning and their career and their post Rockland careers?
Well, I think it took a pandemic to recognize the power and importance of making sure students were on a path to something. and not just a path of exploration in general, but a path to the kind of future that they want for themselves and their families. So the reality is it's now time to think about how educational systems connect with not just the K-12 space, but our business and industry partners in ways that we have not done before, as the country hits a reset in so many different ways. And colleges like the community college are also hitting the reset button because it took a pandemic to challenge systems that have been in place that we thought made sense, but now do not.
Rebecca?
Yeah, well, I love these comments from my fellow panelists. I think when I think about this question, I really like to bring it to life with a single story of someone I met recently. So I want to tell you quickly about John, who actually attended community college, graduated high school, went to community college, but dropped out a few years ago when it became too hard to balance school and work. He works full-time at a coffee shop, earning $26,000 a year. And when the pandemic hit, like so many others, his hours were drastically cut. So he started delivering for Instacart and driving for Uber too. He's got a young daughter and a baby on the way. We actually bonded over the unique difficulties of having a baby during a pandemic, as I did as well. And he really wants a career with a salary he can support his family on. But he doesn't have the time or money to go back to school or participate in a full-time training program. And so for the folks listening today, I ask, if you were John, if you were in this situation, what would you do? A global pandemic, stuck in low-wage work, vulnerable to every crisis, desperate to get ahead, but college doesn't work for you and you're already supporting a family, what would you do? And so as a country, we don't have a clear answer for what people like John should do, even though there are 53 million Americans who are stuck in low-wage work just like him. And so Merit America, what we do as a nonprofit is we provide a path that prepares low-wage workers for in-demand careers and is designed to scale widely. And the biggest impact that we've seen of the horrific pandemic is just the awareness of how essential low-wage workers are and how many folks are stuck in this cycle of difficult work and uncertainty, and also how vulnerable they are to these massive shocks to our system. So in many ways, while it's been a absolutely terrible time to be a low-wage worker, the timing has never been better for folks like us to come together and say, what do we need to do to support them? And what do pathways look like that will work for people who are working?
So Rebecca, both you and there's a lot of entities entering into this space. I try not to call it higher education anymore. I try to call it the pithy post-secondary education and training ecosystem, which just rolls off the tongue. But organizations like yours didn't exist, I don't know how many years ago, but not very many. And I'm curious, and actually maybe start with Michael, how do you see the interplay of all these sort of quote alternative providers, and do we need a lot of different entities trying to sort of come at this set of issues and this problem? Maybe start with you, Michael, and then go to Rebecca.
Well, clearly now is the time to be much more creative than we've ever been on solving problems that we haven't had before. The reality is there needs to be much more critical integration of opportunities and the resources to connect students and employers with the kinds of meaningful engagement that produces educated workers who are great citizens and who can afford to live and build the communities where they are. And so I think that we have to be open from the educational institution side to partner with non-traditional, quote unquote, non-traditional organizations and institutions, so long as the goal is integration, so long as the goal is to build programs that lead people to family supporting wages, and so long as the goal is to ultimately benefit the country as we become a more innovative country in a time when we've gone through a significant period of decline.
So Rebecca, I'm going to back to you, and then I'll come to Sabari also. But do you see yourself as a collaborator with, rather than a competitor to, traditional institutions? And because I guess there's some healthy tension there, potentially healthy, also potentially less healthy. But I'm curious how you see yourself in this sort of landscape.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll say something slightly controversial because on virtual panels, that's the only thing that really excites the audience out there. And I think it'll be honest to say that a lot of folks have actually wagged a finger at community colleges and said the reason that we need players like Merit America and Europe and Perscolis and NPower and all these last mile providers are because community colleges aren't actually preparing folks in a short, accelerated, low-cost way for in-demand jobs. And personally, I actually think that's unfair. So that's the controversial thing, and I will say I disagree with it. I think when you look at the history of community colleges, for the last few decades, the first push was on enrollment. Your job is to get as many folks as possible in the community in the door. Then, in the last decade, 2 decades, it's been about completion. Let's make sure folks are actually earning credentials. And now only really in the last few years has it said, well, actually now you're supposed to be, really tightly aligned to employers and meeting all the employer needs. So I think community colleges are evolving, and there are some phenomenal examples out there that are doing this incredibly well. And we do see community colleges as great actual and then potential partners for our work. At the same time, I think we have to be honest that a 2-year degree or even a 4-year degree is not right for everyone. We have millions of folks who have some college but no degree. They've left higher ed with distrust in the system, and worse than distrust, they've left with significant debt. And they really need things that are designed to meet them where they are, that say it's not about a certain number of hours, it's about how can we get you in the quickest way possible, in a way that works with your life, whether you have jobs, whether you have kids, to go from where you are into a great new career and to not be bound by the traditional restrictions of a higher education credential.
Sabari, how does Nepris sort of fit into this landscape? Do you also, you're less of a, you don't have your own credentials, correct? You're mostly an intermediary?
No. Yeah, we're more of I would call a matchmaker, right? So clearly, unlike Rebecca, we're not actually focusing on last mile opportunities or credentials or full curriculum or certification. We're sort of curriculum agnostic. So we really work well with organizations like the Rockland Community College, specifically because when colleges and K-12 institutions all talk about how do you prepare students for the future of work, I want to point the audience to this Entangled Solutions report that actually points to the 3 pillars of career. You have occupational identity, skills, and social capital. And our focus has always been how can industry and employers, instead of at the very end saying, okay, people are not coming up with the skills or the necessary knowledge to take these jobs they exist, how can we proactively engage them in what I call first exposure? Before we go to last mile, students cannot aspire for something they don't know exists. So we need to broaden their occupational identity. What is the role of employers in getting engaged at that level and giving students that exposure to begin with? It is not solely the job of the college or the educational institution. There has to be a tight partnership with industry and education. And that's where technology tools like ours come in. It's easily said than done. I'm sure Michael will agree to me. You probably had many lunch and learns where you brought employers to the table, had amazing conversations. It was a great networking event. Everybody leaves the room. And then there's not a clear next step of how to engage them with the students. That's really where having technology platforms and established models for engagement can really help not just higher education institutions, even K through 12, and all the educational institutions sort of build their local and global employer community and have established ways of engaging them with students in order to support them on all those 3 pillars: skills, occupational identity, and social capital.
Michael, I want to come back to you. Rebecca sort of stated the criticism that I referred to a little bit in my intro. How fair do you think the historical criticism of traditional institutions has been about whether they are tightly aligned enough with the workforce and are producing graduates or people with the credentials and skills that they need?
Well, first thing we have to remember is that every educational institution is not serving every student the same. The fact is, you come to many of our 4-year institutions because you have a certain prototypical experience, and you come to the community college for a different experience. You're going to enter into a community college because you want the smaller class size, you want the, more closely knitted experience, the wraparound services, and the kinds of things that you might not necessarily get in the 4-year space. That being said, the truth of the matter is all higher education now is going through a metamorphosis because we all recognize that there has to be a reset of the ways in which we have engaged students. We have to make sure that we now are student ready and not simply expecting the students to be ready for this experience, because business and industry industry is in the process of resetting itself. Who knew that there would be a Zoomcaster job as a profession? Who knew that most people would stop working in buildings and work at home? And so you're seeing now lots of folks not even renting their leases for office space downtown anymore. It's all of those things that are resetting in the country at large. And so educational institutions are no different. We're in the process of resetting. What we bring is credibility. We are the folks you know and can count on. And so partnering with community colleges and four-year institutions because of our history of credibility will be very, very helpful to those who are trying to now get into space and to help accomplish the goals. And so I think that there's a certain amount of consumer confidence in our credibility. And while some are not as successful as others in this experience, the fact is, college and credentials, if you look at where folks are going to want ads and sort of do job posts, they always ask for what your educational credential is so that you can get this certain career. So the credibility of college and university is not going anywhere, but there are new players that can benefit from our experience and can benefit from our relationships. And quite frankly, the confidence that people have and still have in higher education writ large.
I mean, listen, I think has historically been, it's an interesting question of whether all those companies that still have bachelor's degree requirements are, whether they're historical remnants, because we are seeing some institutions, some companies start to drop them. And the question of sort of how much it's backward looking versus future looking really comes down to quality. And one of the, I think Michael's right that there are sort of colleges and traditional degrees are known quantities now, and now they've been getting increasingly questioned in terms of their value. But I'm curious for all of you, sort of how you think we do now, and perhaps how we should be judging the quality and value of credentials, whatever they are. I mean, I think, Rebecca, to you, the challenge is a little bit what Michael said, which is, as a new credential, how are you, or a new provider, how do you judge your own quality, and how do you want anybody who might want to judge you from outside to judge you?
Great. Well, it's funny you asked that, because I actually earlier in my career worked for Governor Markell in Delaware on K-12 education policy. And what I remember always thinking was it was so hard to know the impact of a kindergarten readiness program. And, how on earth are we going to really prove the impact of this investment in kindergarten readiness? Because you're going to have to wait at least 3 years to see the impact on third grade literacy, 12 years for, graduation rates, and then 20 plus years for other life-related measures. The great thing about higher ed and workforce is we should all be able to really measure our impact in a much easier way, because the goal for many folks, and not all, but the goal for many folks participating in our programs is to get into a great new career where they can grow and thrive. And so at Merit America, our North Star is how we measure wage gains. What was your wage coming into the program? What is your wage out of the program? And then how do we track that over time to see that you're really on a great trajectory where you're earning a family sustaining wage and you're growing over time? And candidly, we've been really frustrated with the space at large. And now that we're in it, we see why it is so easy to focus instead on, arbitrary rates and to say, well, what percent graduated, or even what percent are employed? And those things are important to track, and we of course track them. But if everyone finishes a program and everyone gets in a job, but that job is no better than the job they would have had otherwise, or that, that job doesn't pay a family sustaining wage, we don't consider that success. So we're trying to really spearhead moving the field and our own practices towards measuring those immediate and then long-term wage gains, as well as a really rigorous measure of life satisfaction. We use the Gallup World Happiness Poll to track how people are feeling about their satisfaction with their lives, before the program, during the program, and then many years after.
Sabari, do you have thoughts on that sort of measurement question or that assessment question?
Yeah, this is it's my pet peeve topic, because one thing that Rebecca said resonated really well with me, because we are not just working with higher education. We strongly believe in sort of career readiness, going all the way to elementary, because sometimes even high school and higher education is a little bit too late to influence the pathway, right? And it's harder and harder to measure that efficacy and outcomes as you go down the grade levels. That is what we are dealing with on a daily basis. So So really, when we talk about what do we need to do to get students ready for the future of work? One thing, I talk about is exposure. Another thing is giving them a platform to sort of practice their skills. And then it's very hard for us to, because we're not a last mile provider, it's very hard for us to measure our success and outcome based on wage gains. Because think about it, we're connecting a sixth grade classroom learning about ratios and proportions with an architect. How do we know that interaction or some continued interaction with that professional has actually led to a fulfilling career, as Rebecca is talking about? So that's much easier to measure. If you're doing this work in higher education, you should be able to really measure how many people going through a program has actually ended up in the right jobs with the right wages and so on. It's harder when you go down the grade levels.
Michael, how do you think about? There's obviously a lot of history in terms of how programs at an institution like yours are assessed and judged, and I think that that landscape is changing. We've seen much greater questioning from governments, particularly in recent years, and I think we're going to see only more of it, especially if it involves government funding. So I'm interested in sort of, do you think that the sort of wage gain approach or something like what the Postsecondary Value Commission released in the last few weeks, where it's sort of a baseline would be having people be better off than if they only had a high school degree in their state. Do you think that a wage-based or economic-based assessment is the right one? And is it the right one for every program at your institution, or is it only for true direct workforce related programs?
The reality is we want to make sure that people are doing better as a result of participating in any kind of educational opportunity that leads them to the family supporting wage that they need and the lives that they deserve. And so the real question is, to what extent are the different players connecting with the ecosystem of opportunity? That, to me, is a metric that we don't really see often. What are the ways in which we are collaborating with higher ed, K-12, business and industry to ensure that the people within the communities are meeting the job vacancies, and that the low-wage worker doesn't stay a low-wage worker, that we don't have academic programs that are bridges to nowhere, but that they're actually going to lead people on a ladder to higher levels of opportunity. To what extent are we getting people on the ladder? So what outreach are we doing to adult learners? We often talk about, who haven't completed credentials and things like that. We have millions of Americans who have some college and no degree, but they've got lots of experience. So to what extent are we giving them credit for prior learning? And to what extent are we doing the upskilling and the retooling? And how are we using traditional and non-traditional educational resources in more integrated collaborative ways to positively impact the viability of the region? And so to me, it is not, it can only be higher ed, it can only be an entrepreneur, it can only be, business and industry creating their own credentials, that we have to find sort of the ecosystem of opportunity in regions and opportunities where we can move people from the lowest to better standing to middle class opportunities. And I think that there's space for all of us to begin to work in this way. Now, in higher education, we are already in reset. We are already beginning to do some of the work that we haven't done in the past, and that have given rise to new players in the space. But I wouldn't certainly count out the power that the higher education ecosystem has as we get into more equitable transfer conversations between 2 and 4 year spaces, as we get into the dual degree program, dual admission programs with high school, as we begin to build out our influence in both directions, and where possible, partnering with others in the space.
I want to just press on this one question a little bit more. Do you all, but Michael, maybe just continue a little bit. Do you think that a purely economic-based way of judging, quote, success or value is appropriate for all of your academic programs? Or do you think that there are other measurements or other things that we'd want to account for? You talked in your opening statement about sort of the alternative to exploration, and yet I worry about losing exploration as something that people do on their educational path. So I'm just curious how economically focused you think the assessment of this ought to be.
Well, part of it is economic, of course, because that is one of the purposes for education. But most of our students don't have a linear path. Most of our students may start out in one thing. I started out as a public interest lawyer, and now I'm a college president. And in between, I did work as an administrator in a college. So it is not that the students will always be in what they are now. Opportunities will continue to evolve as they continue to evolve. But I think we have to look at the educational experience as one that helps the whole person live the life that they deserve. And so economic measures are an important measure, but not the only measure. Their ability to contribute to the society, to the community that they're a part of, and to the country. Those are also measures. There are a lot of intangible measures that actually do a whole lot. There's sometimes you might have an academic program or course where you don't do well, but got the most out of the experience and build some skills that help you in future courses. So I think economics is an important lever, but not the only one.
Rebecca, you talked about wanting how you want to assess yourself and how you'd like to see how your sort of field, as you described it, to be assessed. How broad does that go? And do you think an economic prism works for programs and like yours, but not necessarily across the whole spectrum?
So, it's funny you asked that. Our soapbox in our specific space, which is, a space of folks who exist to help low wage or unemployed workers get into great new jobs. I actually do think the economic measure is the right one. But our soapbox in general is that every organization, especially in the nonprofit space where, you don't have profit as the goal and the metric, needs to really be clear on what are we trying to do, why, and how will we know if we're successful? And I know that might sound pretty obvious, but it's just been amazing to me. Personally, my background was in the public and private sector before co-founding Merit America, to see how many organizations exist with massive amounts of staff, massive amounts of funding, and will point to, oh, well, we have an intangible impact. And again, I agree that not all impact is tangible, but I think even, whether it's measuring civic engagement or measuring, planting a seed for future learning, there are ways to really start to quantify and to look at what we're trying to do. And I worry that it's too easy to say, well, it's just too hard to measure. And so we don't do any measurement, and we spend a lot of time and money on things that aren't actually working. And yes, there might be the occasional anecdotes of folks who have been successful, but for every successful anecdote, you have 10 folks who have left, maybe higher ed with debt and no degree, or they're actually worse off had they not gone at all. Again, big fans of higher ed. We think we will actually be successful in deep partnership with higher ed, but I do think this careful look at what are we trying to do, why, and how will we know it's working, whether that is an economic output or something else, is really important, and it's really been missing.
Another thing I guess I'd like to hear you talk just a little bit about is the question of what your programs build up to or into, and this whole question of sort of stackability and sort of integration of credentials. Because I'm guessing that a lot of the programs that might get somebody up half a rung of a ladder or into a first higher wage job isn't going to be sufficient for most of them. And I'm just curious sort of how you look at that continuum and how you think and again, there's so many entities in this and one of the problems is we don't have a system. It's not a system, period. It's a loose ecosystem. And I'm curious what brings, if anything, brings structure and continuity to credentials, to learning. It's a big question. I don't know if you have an answer, but.
Who's it for?
No, I meant for you. Sorry, just for you, and then I'll go to the others.
I did tell you it was okay to cold call me. It's funny on that one. I actually put a lot of that on employers and the employer ecosystem to be clear. What it looks like, and this is more on the economic side. I'll admit that. But what does it actually look like to progress over time and progress over a career? And what, in fact, is gating someone from going from $25 to $50 to $75 to $100,000 a year job and family sustaining wages. And often we actually hear that On the employer side right now, they're just trying to sort through the noise. And so what you've seen is this massive inflation of degree requirements, which thankfully we're now, I think, seeing a bit of a correction for, and forward-thinking employers removing degree requirements. But it happened because with the advent of technology and the ability to just one-click apply to jobs, all of a sudden folks in talent teams and HR teams around the country were getting inundated. At Merit America, we posted a job, a week ago and already have 1,000 applicants. And so it's really, employers need a filter for how they're going to sort through that. And what's become a very easy filter is just, do you have X degree or Y degree? I think moving away from these filters into really articulating what are the skills and how will we assess folks for them, and what are processes that we can put a lot of folks through to identify the right skills is ideally where we're going in the years and decades to come. But I agree, right now we don't have a system, we have an ecosystem. And I think the big part of what does the stackability look like? It actually starts with employers being very clear of, what are the great opportunities and how does someone work their way up, either within a company or coming from outside of it.
Sabari, I'm interested, do you think employers are clear enough in their own understanding of what they need that they can send those signals? I think, again, thinking about it from the institutional side, I think a lot of college people feel like there've been a lot of mixed signals or non-clear signals. I'm curious, you talk to a lot of employers. Do you sense them knowing where they want to go and being able to define that well enough that they can help potential employees?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Rebecca as far as hiring and what the basis for hiring is. I think that's still evolution. It's still evolving and changing. I don't think there's 100% employers have changed from traditional ways of hiring. But as far as what kind of skills and employability skills and knowledge and other things that they want the future workforce to know, I definitely think there is a level of understanding and change, which they are very well communicating. A lot of what we see through our platform is when employers come and help students evaluate a project, or they're talking about, what are some new tools that they need to be using. They're talking about sort of new communication methods, using Slack and other newer ways of engaging in the workforce. So we do see that change where employers are communicating sort of the change in skills, the change in tools, and what students need to be prepared with. I don't think that has translated into the hiring process of what they're looking for in the actual hiring itself.
We've got a couple of questions from the audience that I want to fold in here. I'm wondering if the panelists can speak to what kinds of navigation tools and coaching, e.g. clearinghouses, that adults can access to help find their way. If you're not connected with a post-secondary institution, how do you find this info and get advice on where to invest very scarce time and resources? I'll just start by saying we're seeing a lot of activity in that space. We're seeing organizations that are intermediaries between employers and institutions, and their employers sort of sending their employees or encouraging their employees to go through certain providers. But I think, again, talking about this lack of a system, it is a tricky thing for where people go. Somebody want to offer some advice here? Yeah, Sabari, go first.
I can start. This is not my expertise. This is not where I spend most of my time, but I do sit on the board of Workforce Solution of Central Texas, and I've had the opportunity to hear more of this discussion in the past year. So in many regions, I think the workforce board is a great place for people to start, especially a lot of the workforce boards work very closely with community colleges, with K-12, with employers in the region. They have very strong ties into the regional ecosystem. And if people don't know where to start, that is a great place, especially the board that I'm on. They do put a lot of effort into supporting low-wage workers and coming up with training solutions and preparing them for employability skills. So if you don't know where to start, that is a great place, is in my opinion.
Michael?
Sure.
Rebecca? Yeah.
Many counties around the country have career centers, and these career centers are often funded by these workforce development boards that have connections with the community colleges, because many of those boards will sponsor some of the shorter term as well as long-term programs and colleges and universities, most specifically public institutions. And so we know that if you can get to a career center in your county, They will actually provide you a way to get services and skill assessments and connections to the appropriate levels of training and education that will move you along your journey. And that can be in the public institutions like community colleges or others. But we do know that there are ways to connect folks with opportunities. We're starting to see now even more closer relationships with unemployment offices and community colleges. And so what we know is that while there is sort of not a definitive system as we would like and much more of an ecosystem, because of or in light of some of what we've seen in the pandemic, some of these systems are tightening. So what you might have seen in the past is sort of just kind of misaligned or sort of externally orbiting folks, we're now starting to come together in ways that we haven't before.
Rebecca, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think those are exactly where folks should go. We actually work with Workforce Solutions in Texas. They're fabulous. And I think workforce boards are increasingly realizing their job isn't about getting unemployed folks into the first job. It's about helping anyone who's unemployed and underemployed really build a career. So I think that's right. And our hope is that those entities just continue to become more and more accessible and tech savvy, because what we hear with the folks we work with who, again, are balancing multiple jobs, multiple family responsibilities, is it is this lack of time. And I saw there was a question in the chat about time, but the lack of time to go somewhere and schedule an appointment and add that into a long list. And so the more we can push those services to folks so that they don't have to make too much time out of their busy day, I think the more effective it will be.
Yeah, and I was going to switch to that question because it aligns with something that I was planning to ask you about anyway, which is sort of what are some of the approaches that we are seeing to help keep up with the evolving skills and skill needs of the economy. The question from the listener or the participant is, in addition to financial barriers to pursuing credentials, we know that having enough time to pursue a degree is a huge challenge. What are you seeing in terms of providers helping learners, quote, solve for time? That could mean apprenticeships, credit for prior learning, other thoughts. There was a lot of talk during the last administration, in some ways maybe more talk than action on apprenticeships, but there are, and Michael, you mentioned prior learning and attempts to try and recognize that learning happens in lots of settings and that students shouldn't have to start over every time they switch institutions or try and start a new little piece of an educational path. But what are some of the things that you see on the landscape that are heartening in terms of addressing the fact that people are either place-bound or just bound by restrictions that don't let them maybe pursue traditional credentials? Michael, do you want to start there?
Sure. Well, quite frankly, in higher education, it might have been almost unheard of that we could automatically, at a drop of a dime, flip from a face-to-face instructional model to an online a virtual experience. Now, some did it better than others, and over time, it will continue to get better. But you will find, and particularly in public institutions, where now we are placing a premium on multiple modalities and not being held hostage to the traditional schedule that we have in the past. This is part of the evolution of higher education. Sometimes it takes a pandemic. And in this case, it took a pandemic to kind of rescue higher education from some of its confining structures that were perpetuated over time as common practice. And so you're going to see much more offerings online and hybrid and on-demand experiences for students. We now provide 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week tutoring and mental health and a whole lot of other services that we never provided in a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis before. And so I think that for those who have said, oh my goodness, higher ed, I don't know if I want to make the investment, now is the best time to make the investment because we're retrofitting so much of what we used to do to be much more in line with what folks need, particularly the low wage person, the person who's the adult learner who has these multiple obligations. To give them credit for what they do know, what they have done as for prior learning. All of that is in the mix now in ways that it really took a pandemic to bring to pass at the scale and the speed in which we're operating.
So spinning forward, I have some fear, maybe too strong a word, but that the compulsion that many institutions and organizations had to change in crisis will be hard to sustain, especially because when we're not in crisis, and or at least not in the same kind of crisis, and when many institutions, at least colleges and universities, and I think other organizations, have been given something of a lifeline by the federal government for a while. And I'm curious how confident the three of you are that that there's going to be enough evolution, enough change, enough experimentation by the various parties to solve this, to make progress in solving this problem. Mike, Sabri, maybe start with you, and then we got just a couple of minutes left, so maybe each of you talk.
I strongly believe that there's some permanent changes that are here to stay. Because one quick example is we're already seeing, like, you take some K-12 institutions that we believe that they are the hardest to change in some cases. We're already seeing some public school districts in Texas offer virtual school as an additional option for students. Already happened, and that there's been policy changes in Texas already saying public schools can allow that. If K-12 institutions can do that, definitely higher education institutions can do that too. So some of these changes I strongly believe are here to stay. How employers sort of perceive and engage with educational institutions, there's also a lot of changes, and virtual, like I said in the beginning, is more acceptable. It's not something that you do when in person cannot happen. Everybody now, from the employers to K-12 to higher education institutions, are planning for a virtual or a hybrid model as an extension to many of the in-person offerings as well.
Rebecca.
Well, I am incredibly optimistic. I'm an impatient optimist, though, so I think we're heading in the right direction, and of course would want it to be going much faster. My biggest fear is that, a lot of folks actually say, well, we tried online and it was a disaster. It was hard. It's not for us. Where what we've always believed at Merit America, and other folks I know share the same, is it's the mix that matters. It's how you mix the flexibility and accessibility with structure and support that matters more than anything. And getting that right takes time, and it takes a real commitment to not giving up on the medium until you figure it out. So we're ultimately super optimistic. And at the end of the day, where we want to see the most changes really coming from employers who realize that if they can build a program to take a 22-year-old straight out of a selective four-year college and get them ready for the job, then they can do the same for someone who's got 10 years of work experience but doesn't have that higher ed degree.
Michael, can institutions like yours avoid complacency?
We have no choice. The reality is we're not going back. And there may be some that would love to go back. But the truth is, higher education is not the only place hitting the reset button. Business and industry is hitting the reset button. All facets of life in some measure are hitting the reset button. And we, like any other part of the ecosystem, want to be moving in the right directions. And I do believe over time we will continue to rise to the occasion as we rose to the occasion in this instance.
We are at time. I want to thank our panelists for some great comments. Thanks all of you for being here and for listening and for your participation. And we hope you have a great rest of the conference and a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Doug.
everyone.
Great to see you, and great to see everybody.